Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, because we know that people are joining from different places in the world. My name is Pradeep Naik. I'm going to be facilitating this webinar series today. But I would like to start with a kind land acknowledgement first, and that is to say that I acknowledge that I live and work on the traditional territory of the Run, Neutral and Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. I recognize that the University of Waterloo is situated on the Aldermont Tract, the land that was promised to the Six Nations, that includes 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River. But I also would like to start with a special note because in Canada, we have today as the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Today marks the second National Day of Truth and Reconciliation in Canada. This is a solemn day to recognize and reflect on the legacy of residential schools in Canada, to refamiliarize ourselves with the 94 calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and to learn and do more to move forward with reconciliation. We sincerely hope you are able to, if you are in Canada or any part of the world, if you identify some of the issues that are involved in the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, we sincerely hope you're able to reflect and participate in ways that are meaningful to you. In my introduction, I am going to do a threefold introduction today. One, that I'm going to introduce the B2B Global Partnership first, and then I will briefly introduce the thematic webinar series for which we have gathered here today. And then I would introduce our two speakers before we start to listen to the talk by both our speakers today. So the Vulnerability to Viability, the V2B Global Partnership, is a transdisciplinary research, knowledge, and action network with over 100 members from Africa, Asia, Canada, and internationally. The goal of the global partnership is to support small-scale fisheries in their transition from vulnerability to viability. And the way we understand vulnerability and viability is not just in an economic sense, but also to represent all aspects of human life. That includes the political, the cultural, the natural, and other aspects. Our focus as part of the work in the partnership is to create the knowledge or co-create the knowledge that is essential for making the transition possible from vulnerability to viability, and how to kind of put the knowledge into repositories or a database that can be used across all levels, right from the community level to the policy and governance levels, that can be used to facilitate the work on the transition from vulnerability to viability. Developing multi-level capacities, we call it transdisciplinary capacities, so that people can effectively engage in the process of moving from vulnerability to viability in small-scale fisheries communities. But also the responsibility of synthesizing, integrating, and analyzing all the information and knowledge in a way that can be readily available and be used for policy, practice, and theory building around vulnerability to viability concepts. The V2B Global Partnership aims to identify the diverse factors, conditions contributing to the vulnerability of small-scale fisheries, and engage collaboratively with small-scale fisher communities and other key NGO, government, and university partners to enhance SSF, or small-scale fisheries viability. We are conducting transdisciplinary community-engaged research in 6 countries in Asia. That includes Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Japan, Malaysia, and Thailand, and 6 countries in Africa. That includes Ghana, Malawi, Nigeria, Senegal, South Africa, and Tanzania. In doing so, the V2B Global Partnership brings people and organizations together across physical, cultural, and disciplinary boundaries through a shared interest in addressing global change impacts on small-scale fisheries. The V2B thematic webinar series, for which we have really gathered here today, is an initiative of the V2B Global Partnership to facilitate and generate high-level discussions on vulnerability and viability themes and topics within the context of small-scale fisheries. The goal is to feature academics, government representatives, practitioners, and members of the civil society who have made significant contributions to the theoretical, practical, and policy aspects of small-scale fisheries, both locally and globally. The B2B thematic webinar series takes place on the last Friday of every month, and it will be taking place throughout the rest of 2022. The series is available internationally through live streaming on YouTube. Details regarding the monthly webinar, including speakers, topics, and titles, and links to webinar platform is available at www.b2bglobalpartnership.org. Today's webinar is the ninth in the series of B2B thematic webinars planned for the year 2022 and the 21st since January 2021 when we actually started. And it is my privilege to introduce Dr. Melissa Marschke and Dr. Peter Vandergeest as our distinguished speakers today. Dr. Melissa Marschke is a professor at the University of Ottawa in its School of International Development and Global Studies. Her training is in human environment relations with an emphasis on livelihood, social-ecological complexity, and resource governance. Dr. Marschke's geographical focus is Southeast Asia, although recently she has become interested in seafood in Canada and the Caribbean, resulting in her involvement in related research projects. Dr. Marschke is currently conducting research on precarious work across the seafood sector, as well as sand livelihoods. Dr. Peter Vandergeest is Professor Emeritus of Geography at York University in Canada. He has been conducting research on livelihoods among marginalized resource users in Southeast Asia since the 1980s. Dr. Vandergeest's research is based in a political ecology approach that starts with the direct resource users, which involves farmers, fishers, gatherers, and laborers, and locates what they do in multi-scale transformations in how these resources are remade and governed. His current research concerns working conditions among migrant workers in industrial fisheries. It is my honor to invite Dr. Melissa Marschke and Dr. Peter Vandergeest to deliver today's talk for the B2B thematic webinar series 2022. And the talk that they're going to deliver is titled as Unacceptable Working Conditions in Global Fishing, Lawlessness, Criminality, and Enabling Policies and Political Economies. I will first pass it on to Dr. Melissa Marschke. Over to you, Melissa.
Thank you, Pradeep. Thank you for the warm welcome and the invitation to give this talk with B2B. Before we start, we also wanted to acknowledge that this is the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. We've included a web link, one that we really like because it really looks at how Canada is doing with regards to the 94 recommendations in achieving results towards the report, the Truth and Reconciliation report. You'll see that we have a way to go. The web link is written from an Indigenous perspective. It also focuses on other issues that Indigenous people see as pressing. So I'd really encourage you to look at it if you're interested to understand more about what's happening. As Pradeep said, this talk will focus on work at sea. And this is something Peter and I have been working on for nearly a decade now. So what we thought we would do in this talk, because we know everyone's has a background in fishing, a lot in small scale fishing, but I imagine a series of things across the fisheries. We thought we would talk about forced labor in fisheries and then get into for working conditions in particular in the distant water fisheries. So in the high seas, what does that mean? In part because high seas fisheries are relatively new. They've exploded in the last 10 years. And so we'll look at what that means for workers, mostly migrant workers from Asia or West Africa in those fisheries. We'll then get into thinking about the policy and jurisdictional challenges. Why does this continue to persist? and then think about a path forward for Canada, for those in the audience that are interested in what Canada is or is not doing. I should also say, by way of explanation, that Peter and I, our background is actually small-scale fisheries and aquaculture. Peter started working in Thailand in the 80s with Fuso. So he has a long experience of kind of agrarian change fieldwork, forest, fisheries, and fish farming. I started in the late 90s in Cambodia, also working on small-scale fisheries, livelihoods, commons governance. And so that's both our backgrounds. And that's important to know because the reason we got interested in this work very much links to the scandals that emerged in the mid 2010s. And so the media and civil society groups really started, well, I'd say more, not civil society so much as advocacy organizations like Greenpeace or Environmental Justice Foundation, along with the Associated Press, the New York Times. They started doing really important coverage of what was happening in Thai fisheries, looking at the labor abuse that was taking place mainly for Burmese and Cambodian migrant workers working in the Thai fisheries. And so that scandal broke, and part of the scandal was the Associated Press and the Guardian. They were actually able to trace seafood bought on Thai boats with horrific conditions were then sold to the UK or North American supermarkets. So it sort of woke everyone up. Scandals have continued to persist, though. There was the Thai scandals, and our research really started trying to unpack what does this mean. We didn't dispute that there was really terrible working conditions, but we recognized there was a whole continuum of experiences for migrant workers, and there was reasons why people continue to migrate to work in these fisheries. Also, Thailand began a major fisheries reform, and we were interested to understand how that was unfolding, how that was working. As distant water fisheries, I think I mentioned, they've exploded since the 2010s as they increased. Greenpeace and Environmental Justice Foundation also started campaign work in Taiwan, partly because China was impossible to access. And so started also showing that, wow, there's a problem with fisheries here too, including labor abuse. And it's kind of continued. And the key note here, and something I guess we probably have argued for a while, is that labor abuse in fisheries has been going on for quite a while, and it's not unique to a particular fishery. It's not unique to only long distance fisheries. So out in the high seas, it's also happening in EEZ fisheries. And we're seeing that in campaigns around Europe, in New Zealand, et cetera. But for today, we're going to focus on the distant water fisheries because that's where the bulk of our research has been. So distant water fisheries, high seas fisheries. The largest fleets in the world belong to China, Taiwan, Korea, Japan, and Spain. So 4 out of the 5 are Asian fleets. As I said, a meteoric rise in the last 10 years, particularly in China post-2016. So there's a lot of really big boats, and you want to think about these boats as almost like industrial farms on the seas for fish. And it's boats that are out for long periods of time, and most of the crew tends to be migrant workers, mostly from Southeast Asia, but also from West Africa, depending on where crew is picked up. This map, what's important about this map is it was our way to get a sense of the actual routes that boats were taking. These big boats are taking huge long distance routes that is really quite global in nature. So if you look at the red, for example, those are boats that would be based in Taiwan. They would first go down over South Africa through Cape Town, all the way over to the Falkland Islands. They would come back, and then they would go to Japan to do a different kind of fishing known as a Sauri fishery, and then come back. And that's a route that takes a year, this back and forth. Longliner is a similar story. That's typically for tuna. Longliners are set relatively near the top of the water. They're often going around East and South Africa, in and out in the Indian Ocean. And then you have purse seiners, which kind of are round and like a circle net, scooping everything up. And that's more in the Asia Pacific region. All of these routes, the men on the boats, it's a male workspace, are out at sea for a minimum of a year, sometimes far longer. Peter will explain more about this, but unlike other seafarers, this is a case where there's no limit on a contract. And so a contract could be for 2 years or 3 years. And so you're out at sea for a long time with minimal time at port, and it's partly enabled by transshipment at sea. Transshipment, if anyone hasn't heard that term, the large boats that would carry fuel, extra food, but also have storage for fish. And so fish could be offloaded onto these transshipment boats. Fuel could be put on the boats. And this way, the actual fishing vessels, the longliners or purseines or spit-driggers, don't have to go into port. The only way people can get to these jobs, especially in the distant water fishery, unlike the Thai example where we talked about Thai or in Thailand about Burmese or Cambodian workers who could go by land, to really be on these big boats, it's so vast where the boats are going. You have to fly there, you have to get there by boat. And thinking about how workers get to Taiwan, because that's the case we're most familiar with, the majority of workers are Indonesian, but there's also Filipino and Vietnamese workers. They might go by boat to Singapore or to Taiwan. They might also be flown and could possibly board a vessel in Cape Town in South Africa, because it's cheaper to fly crew to Cape Town because the majority of the work is happening near the Falkland Islands. When you're traveling such long distances, you're not fishing everywhere. You're targeting particular types of global high seas fishing grounds. One of the challenges, and I'll talk a bit more about this in a second, is that people get their jobs in their home countries. So if you're Indonesian, you're going to a recruitment agency in Indonesia. Could be that you had a neighbor that's doing this kind of work. It could be there was an advert, but however it is, it's the crewing agency that's mitigating your employment in Taiwan or in Japan or on whatever fleet you happen to get work on. And so there's this intermediary, and this is where a lot of problems happen. Our focus is on the distant water fisheries, but as I already emphasized, it's not just in distant water high seas fisheries that migrant workers find themselves vulnerable. There's unsafe conditions in many fisheries and low pay as well. So this is a news article from The Guardian last year. Unsafe conditions and low pay for migrant workers on Irish fishing boats exposed. If there's time in the Q&A, this is sort of another project that Peter and I are working on, really trying to understand EEZ fisheries in Europe, focusing specifically on Ireland and understanding the type of campaigns that have emerged and the wins and the losses at this moment. So we would, as we've been doing this work, and I should say that it's not just us doing interviews. We have PhD students that work with us. We work with campaigners. We work with local counterparts. We've interviewed faith-based organizations. There's been a lot of people that we've talked with, including, of course, fish workers. We've come up with a broad characterization about the main challenges we think migrant workers face. And so let me take you through each of those. So the first is that work is exceptionally dangerous. In a way, that's nothing new, because fish work has always been dangerous and across all scales, right? There's a storm. How far are you away from land? Can you seek shelter? What if you fall in the water? Where do you sleep if there's a storm and you're out at night? I mean, this is something I think all fishers face. In Canada, one of our national newspapers, the Globe and Mail, had a story about fish work being Canada's deadliest job already in 2017, where the journalists actually looked through stats and sort of mortality rates and came up with fishing. And it was partly linked to often fishers are not wearing life jackets for a variety of reasons. So you fall in the water, could be hyperthermia, it could be that you get hit by the boat or a piece of gear. Physical exhaustion, you're working long hours. The fact that the workspace isn't particularly safe. There's ropes that are consistently moving. There's lots of metal. There's sharp objects. It is not a particularly safe workspace if it's still, never mind when it's wavy. so those are sort of the main, the cold weather and how you're out at sea for a long time, and that just seeps into you and continues to make it difficult. So those are the main reasons why it's exceptionally dangerous across scales. But then you add in long hours, and I think this is where hours can sort of get compounded, particularly in high seas fisheries or distant water fisheries. So this is one quote that I took from a paper we wrote. In our research, migrant workers in the Taiwanese distant water fishing fleet describe moments of intense work and moments of rest. So in the case of a squid jigger that was setting out for the Falkland Islands, that was on the map, it went through South Africa, Cape Town, and kept going. Workers described relatively light loads of work initially, which still are maybe 10 or 12 hours a day. So it's not light by any other standard. But once you found the fish, in this case, squid, the work became really intense, and it could be, and they would flip around how they described it to us and say, well, we work all day and all night, but we get a couple hours rest. And this could go on for days and days. And so when you actually find the fish, there is pressure to work hard. And it's, the hours are long in part because there's not always a lot of crew on a boat, because there's not a lot of space in a boat to sleep or for crew to be. And so you've got minimal crew working for long hours, and there's also intense pressure to do the work, which probably can be linked to the fact that fish are getting harder and harder to find in this era of climate shifts, overfishing, et cetera. So this all contributes to really long working hours. This just came out 2 days ago, is, again, Canadian news, is the world's deadliest profession also among the most violent. Thousands of deaths take place each year, and much of it is a lawless frontier. And this was an interview that a reporter at CBC did with Ian Urbina, sorry. He's a reporter and journalist. He worked for the New York Times for years, and he wrote the book Outlaw Ocean, and has produced a podcast series, which I recommend you listening to, that really talks about the challenges of distant water fisheries work and the violence workers experience. He's one of the only journalists and researchers I know that has spent months on distant water boats, really hearing and talking to workers. Violence is happening for a number of reasons. One is this pressure to maximize the amount of fish you catch, and the way that's done, because you need workers to work long hours, is intimidation. This is something we heard consistently across our interviews, that captains would, at a minimum, yell or threaten, or especially threaten violence, or threaten to not to have wage deductions. So there was this pressure to consistently work. The workers don't have much space, they're tired. There's also a multi-ethnic makeup on the crew. And so this can increase tensions, partly because language skills will differ, and different main languages are being spoken. The captains, at least on Taiwanese boats, typically speak Mandarin, and most folks in Southeast Asia or West Africa are not speaking Mandarin. So there's a language issue. So there's many reasons why violence kind of escalates as people get more and more tired in this space. I think I've mentioned about the long periods working on a boat. This news article came out during COVID. Trapped by pandemic, ship crews fight exhaustion and despair. And most of the media focused not on fish workers, but actually on cargo and cruise workers, who took months to actually finally disembark. Ports shut down, and so all the people out at sea were stuck, including fish workers. And for fish workers, it was particularly problematic because they didn't have to offload cargo. Remember, there's transshipment, and transshipment could handle that. And so some of the workers we've spoken with had huge pressure during COVID to extend their contract and keep working, meaning they could have effectively been on a boat by the time they left for 3 years. More than that, workers during COVID were, because they were banned from coming into port. This is a picture our PhD student Mallory McDonald took, and it says, you are entering COVID-19 control area, no docking without permission. We heard this over and over again, where you could either not dock or you were stuck out at port and workers couldn't leave the boat. That meant they had no communication. They couldn't access Wi-Fi. And so they were so close to shore without actually being able to communicate or have access to support services or medical care or anything like this. So long periods at sea is a huge issue that's just been enhanced during the pandemic. The salaries are low. Many of the workers we've spoken with have been quite frank with us and said, look, we don't want to do fish work. We want to do cargo work, which pays better. But the only way we'll do that is we have to start with fish work. So it's known to be low, but it's also low between the fleets. And so there's a bit of a pecking order as to where fair pay is, with Spanish fleets paying far better than, for example, a Chinese fleet. I haven't, Peter, we'll get into this a little bit. I haven't gotten into sort of the reforms that are happening in Taiwan, and there are reforms happening. So I don't want to suggest that there's this void of governance and there's not a response, but I think we just need to still characterize that salaries, even with reforms, remain relatively speaking low. And people can get away with it because in the sending countries, the salaries seem higher, right? Men face pressure to provide for families and are taking this risk by going out on boats. And so that can be exploited. And so this has typically been the way that costs remain low in fisheries is the salaries. And finally, life on a boat is not so easy. Peter and I have not actually been out at sea for months at a time for a number of reasons, including it's probably pretty dangerous, but there's also not huge space. But we have toured boats and we talk to people a lot at port. The bottom picture, it's just like a sneak through a cabin hole of a cabin, of a fisher cabin. It's 3 bunk beds, three levels, 9 men in a little space, basically 3 levels. And so you can see it's really tight. There's the sleeping space and there's the kitchen space to eat, and that's it. So there's not much space from other workers or ability to have any downtime. We smelled septic, we smelled gasoline on the boat. Workers talked about there not being enough fresh water. And while there's, certainly food on boats, they don't necessarily take into account dietary considerations and can be fairly monotonous in the same type of food day in, day out. So living on a boat, oh, I should also add it's hard to wash. There's not usually fresh water to wash. So that's tough after months and months and months. So that's our overview of living conditions or work conditions in general, ending with living conditions. And I'm going to turn it over to Peter, who will now think about why this continues to happen, because it's a little bit surprising in some ways. So Peter, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, it just occurred to me that my picture is not going to be on the screen unless there's some way of putting me on.
You're on? No?
Yeah, I don't think anybody can see me. I can only see you, Melissa.
I think people can see us. I can only see you.
Well, regardless, I will go on. So my part is a little bit more optimistic. I'm going to be looking more also at improvements or ways that the working conditions in fisheries can be improved. I was going to mention I'm wearing an orange shirt today. It's a very specific orange shirt, and it's to remember the many thousands of Indigenous children who were taken from their parents over a period of about a century, ending only in the 1970s and 80s, and put into residential schools in Canada, which were basically organized around trying to take the Indigenous out of the kids, is the way they put it, or the Native out of the kids. It's now recognized as a kind of a cultural genocide. Kids suffer terrible trauma that Indigenous people are still suffering the effects of today, many of them, and many died as well. And the orange shirt thing started actually, really sort of took life last year when thousands of graves, hidden graves, unmarked graves were discovered around some of these old residential schools. So this is something one does in Canada on today to basically commemorate both Truth and Reconciliation Day and the cultural genocide that took place in Canada in the residential schools. So going on, like I said, my part of the talk is a bit more optimistic, but it's going to be complicated as well, because I'm going to get into jurisdictional and legal aspects of all of this. The point, and so I'm going to talk about some of the ways in which working conditions can be improved, but also some of the explanations for why working conditions in fisheries are so bad, largely focusing on the kind of legal and jurisdictional aspects. So one of the arguments is the argument that you're going to see most commonly, and Ian Urbana, the author who works on this, is an example. His work is great, by the way, because he's really done serious field work. But what you start, the kind of immediate response one has when hearing about these stories of awful abuse is to blame bad employers, captains, supervisors, or bad and criminal fishing companies. So taking this approach often leads to the conclusion that oceans are lawless spaces where criminal operators can fish illegally, traffic in people, as well as other, engage in other criminal activities such as smuggling illegal drugs and so on. And organizations and researchers who take this approach point out that vessels where workers are very badly abused, held captive, and so on, are often the same as those that fish illegally around the world. They might be fishing for endangered species such as sharks and this kind of thing, and they think there's an association between them. So the goal then becomes to figure out who are the bad operators and to go after them. So the solution then is policing and criminal law. And by the way, to the degree to which this can be framed as human trafficking, trafficking is a matter of criminal law. But at the same time, our research indicates that these working conditions are a pattern across entire fishing sectors. Although there are definitely bad and criminal operators, you're not going to solve the full problem by just going after them. One needs to take a sectoral approach. And not only that, it's important to take not just a policing approach, but also a labor approach to understand labor law and to understand what enables the bad operators. In other words, don't just blame the bad operators, but why are those bad operators there in the first place? What makes it possible for them to be that way? And then to put this also, we argue, in the context of capitalist fishing. This is industrial fishing, it's capitalist fishing, it's about global seafood assembly chains and so on. And in the context of the government policies that either don't reach out and engage in sufficient regulation, but sometimes even enable this kind of abuse. So, slide. Our first point is that there's, with regard to what we call the lawless ocean approach, is that it's not really correct that there are no laws on the ocean. The laws that apply on the ocean has been outlined by an international UN convention. I think many of you might be familiar with it. It's conventionally called the Law of the Sea. So according to the Law of the Sea, the flag state has primary jurisdiction over labor and working conditions on ships. The flag state is where the vessel is registered. This is the case even if that vessel is in the EEZ of another state. So for example, if you've got a Taiwanese flag vessel fishing in, for example, Seychelles water, then the working conditions on that vessel are still under this jurisdiction of Taiwan. It has nothing to do with Seychelles, although Seychelles might be the one who manages the fisheries. Some fishing vessels are flagged with flags of convenience, as with shipping, but and it is a problem, but the proportion of that in fishing is much less than in shipping, largely because what flag you fly can affect your legal access to different fisheries around the world. And even in those cases, there's increasing pressure on states where the fishing companies are located to take more responsibility for what's happening on those vessels. Even if, for example, you have a Taiwanese vessels that might be flagged to the Marshall Islands, it doesn't matter, Taiwan should take responsibility for what's happening on those vessels. So we see this then in our research for the Taiwan distance water fisheries, for example, where Taiwan is starting to do exactly that under pressure from under global pressure to do so. So you want to, Melissa, click? Get more. Yes. Okay, so the flag state isn't the only relevant state. A series of other states are involved as well, and this makes it really a complex problem. I've listed some of them here. So a few comments. So on port states, this is actually a very interesting one. So these vessels from Taiwan, they will enter ports in Cape Town, in Singapore, in Seychelles, and many other places around the world. When that vessel enters a port other than their flag state, for the workers to leave the vessel and access shore services, or for example, support organizations, they're effectively crossing an international border. In other words, working conditions on that vessel remains under the jurisdiction of the flag state, even when it's in port. The other side of it is that port officials or support organizations also need to cross a border in order to go on the vessel and talk to workers and see what's going on there. So this makes it kind of complex. So strictly speaking, port inspectors are only legal when there's a right to do so specified by an international treaty or a convention that's been ratified by the port state. So one of our questions when we go and talk to seafarers, support organizations, or union inspectors like ITF inspectors is whether they can board fishing vessels or otherwise access workers and how. And the responses we find varies actually a lot by port and port state. Different port states have different policies on these kinds of things and also different port authorities. And it's changed over time. So for example, during COVID, access to workers became a huge problem because many countries barred workers from disembarking from their vessels because of the way this effectively involves crossing an international border. And many workers couldn't access shore services and the support organizations couldn't access the workers. Luckily, those sorts of restrictions are being loosened now. There are other international treaties that do allow port inspectors to board vessels flagged to countries other than the port state. So many of you might know about the FAO administered agreement on port state measures, which has been fairly widely ratified. And it allows ratifying states to inspect fishing vessels that enter their ports for possible IUU fishing, illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing, and to bar vessels engaged in IUU fishing from using their ports. So this is not specifically about the working conditions of the crew, but it can be indirectly helpful, at least to the degree that vessels engaged in IUU fishing might also be more likely to not treat workers well, be engaged in other illegal activities and so on. So when the inspectors go on board, it becomes an opportunity to just kind of take a look around to see what's happening with the crew. A more important agreement potentially in the future for the situation of workers on vessels is the 2012 Cape Town Agreement, which is administered through the International Maritime Organization. And it includes a lot of provisions on the safety and the condition of the crews and observers on the vessels. It's not yet entered into force because only 17 states have ratified so far, but there are many countries which have indicated a commitment to doing so. So it's not yet a major treaty for, that people in ports can use to go on vessels and check on working conditions, but it could be in the future. And finally, there's two other conventions, which I will talk about in more detail in a few minutes. This is the Maritime Labor Convention and the Work and Fishing Convention. So click next slide. Sorry, I have to be back. Sorry, go back one. Yeah, I'm going too quick here. So just a few comments on the other states that I mentioned. So EEZ or coastal states are becoming more involved in working conditions on distance water fishing vessels operating in their exclusive economic zones that are flagged to other countries, although they don't actually have jurisdiction over labor, according to international law. What they can do is make meeting some labor standards a condition of access to fishing in their exclusive economic zones. And New Zealand is kind of the leading country in this. They have actually forced distant water fishing vessels that have leases to fish in their EEZ to reflag to New Zealand, so that in that case, New Zealand labor law actually does apply on those vessels. They've gone the furthest, but other countries are looking at making the Work and Fishing Convention standard, for example, a condition of accessing fishing in their countries. And some international organizations are doing so as well. There's been discussion of doing this by RFMOs, the regional fishing management organizations, and importantly, a group called the Pacific Island Forum Fishing Agencies, which is comprised of most of the Pacific Islands, 17 Pacific Island states. They administer a lot of the tuna fisheries together, and they're adding crewing and labor standards to their conditions of access for fisheries, okay? So these are some of the more positive developments. So home states for migrant workers in fisheries also become involved, sometimes through specific problems experienced by their nationals. So we talk to, so for example, if you have Indonesian workers on a boat coming into Cape Town, and they have some really kind of serious problem with being abused and so on, they are typically through Stella Maris or an organization like that, they will access their Indonesian consulate and the consulate will help them out. But their most important role actually is the crewing agencies, because crewing agencies are often blamed for many of the problems involving contracts, especially, but also enabling abuse because, for example, if you have a 2-year contract, they will not pay your way back, and they will not pay back your deposits unless you finish the contracts, which make it very difficult for workers to leave an abusive situation. So a lot of the problems are blamed on the crewing agencies, and there's a lot of pressure on source countries to, source countries in the sense of the Philippines and Indonesia, where workers are coming from, to tighten down the regulation of these crewing agencies. I don't know what's happening with Ghana, because it's also a bit of a source country for workers in Europe. By the way, I know some of you are from Ghana. I'm going to talk more about the seafood importing states in a few minutes. So I'll skip over that and go to the next section. The key takeaway point from that, by the way, is that improving working conditions, insofar as we're talking about government policy, is that it takes coordinated action on the part of many governments and many other actors. I'm going to bring in some other actors in a minute, even though the flag state is still really the primary responsibility. Another problem that we have with what we call the lawless ocean approach is the focus on criminality doesn't address the broader, what we think of the broader enabling conditions for unacceptable working conditions. So unlike the criminality approach, which kind of blames and goes after bad operators, this approach takes into consideration the entire fishing sector. So the causes are complex, and I just want to run through a few key points. And we can start with global capitalism. Now, I admit we haven't had an emphasis on this so far in our project. We have somebody, Philip Kelly, whose role it is kind of to look at this, though. The industrial fishery sector is structured like much of the rest of the agro-food sector, which is that you have a few big transnational seafood companies or retailers, operators like Thai Union. Well, you probably know some of the names. And what they do is they're buying from seafood companies that, even though they might be large in the sense that they own large ships, compared to the big transnational seafood companies, they are dispersed in ports around the world, operate maybe 1, 2, maybe 10 ships, 20 at most. So they, in a sense, are dispersed around the world, and they basically are price takers, in a sense, from the big transnational seafood companies. So, for example, in tuna, according to Campling and Havis, who write on the kind of political economy of fisheries, there's only about 240 processing plants for tuna around the world, and just 5 tuna brands dominate in Europe and North America. So it gives you an idea of the domination of these kind of big kind of actors in the middle of these, what I call a seafood assembly line. Now, I also recognize that with seafood, it's quite diverse. There's lots of small companies and niche products. I would say that for the industrial fisheries that we're looking at, most of it is really kind of dominated by products sold by these, to the bigger transnational companies. Okay, and so what this does is it means that the fishing companies, they're in effect competing with each other in order to be able to sell at a price to the big seafood companies, which means that they're constantly having to look for ways to reduce their prices. And one of the key ways they can reduce their prices is then by reducing the cost of labor, since most of the other costs that they have are not under their control. And it's one of the reasons then that fishing companies around the world have been trending to hiring very low-cost migrant workers, even in EEZ fisheries, as well as in, the DWF fisheries. So another what we call enabling condition is a series of government policies. So unacceptable working conditions for migrant workers in fishing, where we argue is not just due to lawlessness on the ocean, or even a lack of enforcement of existing laws, but some laws actually enable the abuse of workers. And these are the two key ones. First of all, migration policies can make workers vulnerable by how they usually tie workers to employers. So when you get status as a migrant worker, this is true in Canada, it's true around the world. Typically, you get that legal status as a migrant worker by being registered with an employer, and you can't leave that employer very easily. And that makes you vulnerable to that employer. You can't leave it without losing the employer, without losing legal status. So we see this in many countries where fisheries employ migrant workers. So let's a quick click to the next slide here. It's on Ireland. There you go. So we were in Ireland this past summer, and there we talked to ITF workers and an ITF staff person, the union staff, and also some fish workers. And there's pretty strong evidence that when Ireland some years ago decided they would move from just letting fishing companies hire workers in an undocumented way surreptitiously, and that they would actually go about documenting these workers, that the migrant workers actually became worse off. And it's ended up making working hours longer, abuse has increased, the amount of racism has increased, and so on. And it's because what documentation did was it tied those workers to their fishing, to their captains, to their fishing companies, and the fishing companies knew this, and this meant that they could start to, for example, force them to work longer hours and so on. So the final point I want to mention is how fishing is often exempted from key provisions in labor laws and employment standards. So next slide. It should be the list again. Yeah, there we go. So in Taiwan, for example, the distance water fisheries is exempted from the Labor Standards Act, which is administered by the Ministry of Labor. And instead, working conditions and labor in the DWF fisheries is regulated under the Distance Water Fishing Act, which is administered by the Fisheries Agency. So in other words, the fishing agency is responsible for labor, working conditions and labor relations, and fishing people are typically not experts in that topic. So it's a problem. This kind of thing is true in many other jurisdictions to a greater or lesser degree. So for example, in Canada, labor regulations in fisheries falls under provincial jurisdictions, and many provinces have in fact exempted work in fishing and seafood processing from employment standards. So for example, in Ontario and Nova Scotia, workers in both fishing and agriculture, they're often treated together, are exempt from provisions in employment standards that include the minimum wage, hours of work, not surprisingly, rest periods, overtime, holidays, and rest days. And by the way, this is not true in Newfoundland, where the fishing unions have been very strong and stopped this from happening. So you can see what influence unionization can sometimes have. Unfortunately, unionization is fairly rare in fishing. So how these exemptions are typically justified in ways that you, I think, probably would expect, which is mostly the biophysical nature of fishing is not compatible with standards that were often created with factories in mind. So this is also the case internationally. Next slide. Yeah, so I mentioned that there are two conventions for seafarers or workers who work on oceans. One is the Marine Labor Convention. And this is a very broad-based convention that covers all seafarers and has a lot of very detailed provision, including shore access, which we mentioned is an issue for workers because it crosses a border, living conditions, and many things like that. As with labor law nationally, though, fishing is exempted. It specifically says this does not include fishing. So it basically defines workers in fishing as not seafarers. So to fill the gap, the ILO has created another convention called ILO C188. With a different set of standards, and in order to convince countries to ratify it, those standards are they're a good starting point, but they're much weaker than those in the Marine Labor Convention. And I won't run through it, but let's just say, for example, on matters involving shore access, which is really crucial when you've been at sea for many months to be able to access shore. Well, you only have right to access shore services if you have a serious medical problem, for example, as opposed to the Marine Labor Convention, where you basically have right to access a whole series of shore services. So you can see what the problems are. It is definitely a big step forward. So far, it's just come into force not so many years ago. Only 20 countries have ratified, including so far none of the big distance water fishing countries. But it is becoming increasingly influential. Spain, which is one of the big DWF fishing countries, is apparently close to ratifying, and Taiwan has made it the basis of its regulatory reforms, although it can't ratify, giving it special status. Some international organizations are also making C188 the basis of their labor standards. For example, it's the Pacific Island Forum Fishing Agencies. Once is planning to make adherence to these standards as a key part of their a condition of access to their fisheries. So quick slide. I see that I'm kind of running down a little bit on time. I do want to mention governments are not the only actors involved in improving fishing working conditions in fisheries. And there's two other sets of actors I want to mention. The first is private sector, where you see two kinds of action. One would be seafood companies, or I shouldn't say seafood, seafood companies, the big transnational companies who are increasingly trying to impose conditions on their suppliers. This is difficult, though, because the supply chains are often so complex and obtuse, and it might go through aquaculture and so on. But, you know, some do for reputational reasons, to avoid lawsuits, which have been happening. And some, I think, just because they truly are actually committed to improving working conditions in fisheries. They don't want to source their raw materials from vessels where workers are being abused. The second set of actions, this is really getting a lot of attention, is third-party certification. Some of you may be familiar with some of this. So you have recently the formation, this is really just starting now, the Responsible Fishing Vessel Standard. The group that did this is called, I forget their name, but they basically expanded from certification in aquaculture, which is something I worked on some years ago. And they've added wild-caught seafood to what they're doing. One of the things you'll notice is that the MSC, the Marine Stewardship Council, is not on their list. So what the people for the Responsible Fishing Vessel Standard are doing is they're proposing to this is off the record, I've just been hearing this, to the MSC, that the MSC certification becomes part of their broader certification. So they're trying to subsume the MSC. So you can see kind of where the action is. Many of you, by the way, know what FIPs are, the Fisheries Improvement Projects. And these are also starting to add some social, unlike the MSC, I might say they're starting to add social standards to their standards as well. So you can see there's a lot of, and it also is structured as a kind of a third-party certification. So you can see kind of where the action is there's a lot of action on the certification side as well, or third-party certification. Next slide. Oh, okay, let me just go through this. Just go to the next slide. I'm running short of time. I want to mention these support organizations. These people are crucial, especially today as workers get cell phones and become more able to access support services. We have been working a lot through port chaplains who play a crucial role in dealing with day-to-day immediate problems of workers, and sometimes lobbying for broader change as well. So they, when we do interviews in different ports, we have been interviewing many of their chaplains they're amazing people. And there's a lot of NGOs. For example, in Taiwan, you have to serve the People Foundation, you have them in Thailand, you have them everywhere, many of them working. And they both deal with the immediate needs of fish workers who are having major issues, but also will lobby governments for changes as well. They kind of play both a political role and the immediate surface need. The unions, again, similar. ITF is the big union for seafarers, mostly focused on fishing, on shipping. But they've recently also launched some campaigns around fishing as well. They are active in Thailand and in Ireland, for example. So we've been working with them a little bit. Some recent developments, you've got the development of some port-based associations where workers will actually form unions at the level of the port. They don't engage in collective bargaining like unions normally do, but they are able to kind of mobilize, make demands, lobby governments, and so on. And finally, what we call migrant worker associations. So the key one here, the one that I think about all the time, is SBMI in Indonesia. It's a broad union that encompasses all migrant workers who go abroad in Indonesia, has hundreds of thousands of members, but they have made fisheries a major part of their activity as well, helping workers in fisheries, because workers in fisheries have some of the most problems of any migrant workers in any sector. So these are some of the key civil society organizations and the like that are also involved in pushing for and helping, supporting workers in fisheries. Next slide. Okay, I just want to mention very briefly, this will take a couple minutes. This is a talk I've done also in Norway and Sweden. And so there's a lot of interest when you do talks in places like North America and in Europe, what importing countries and consumers will do. For example, should consumers stop eating seafood or seafood that they believe might be produced by workers who are being abused by forced labor and so on? My answer personally is always, if do it, but don't think it's going to have an effect on the working conditions. Do it, for your own benefit. But where the real impact is really more in the major players like importing governments and the seafood corporations. With respect to importing governments, there's been a whole series of acts, mostly in North America and Europe, legislation, laws, and so on, which aim to try to improve, which kind of target countries and fisheries that are outside of their jurisdiction, where working conditions have been identified as being particularly problematic, to try to sometimes through sticks and sometimes through carrots to try to get them to improve the working conditions. Some of the first two we think have not been particularly effective so far. This is the Modern Slavery Acts. In the UK especially is most famous. The anti-human trafficking approach, which is really led by the US and their trafficking in persons reports, it's had some influence, but because trafficking tends to be a criminal offense and is very hard to prosecute, it generally doesn't address the broader sectoral issues. Finally, the EU program to eliminate IUU fisheries, we think it had quite a positive effect in Thailand, but it doesn't always. It needs to incorporate labor conditions for it to have a positive effect on working conditions. In situations where labor conditions are ignored, it can actually have the opposite effect. And we argue this has probably been the case in Vietnam, for example. And finally, bans on imports made with forced labor. The US has been very active on this. They've designated a bunch of Chinese and Taiwanese vessels as using forced labor, and importers of certain products need to show that those fish were not caught by those vessels. Okay, next slide. Okay, but there's a lot of issues with this approach, we think. One of them is that not many of these sort of programs take the broader sectoral approach that we think is the most effective, especially the kind of Modern Slavery Acts. It tends to try to identify bad operators and go after them. Doesn't address the enabling policies like migration policies. I am always uncomfortable with the kind of underlying imperialism in these kinds of approaches, where Europe and especially, but even North America, will be telling countries, for example, in Asia and Africa, what they should be doing, what is the moral and ethical and right thing to do. I think at the extreme, it can go into what we call right rescue syndrome, which these would be some of the anti-slavery NGOs, which are really looking for poor brown people around the world that they can rescue from their terrible conditions. It's a really problematic way, I think, of trying to improve working conditions in fishing. And finally, we think it's also undermined when migrant workers in the fisheries of the countries that are imposing these policies in other countries, when workers in their own fisheries are also experiencing a lot of issues. So for example, Ireland, which is part of the EU, we've been doing research there. We've had workers from Ghana tell us that working in the Irish fishing is actually worse than, for example, working on Chinese vessels that are fishing off of the coast in Ghana. So, it's kind of like you got to fix your own home before you start telling other people what to do. So there's a lot of issues. At the same time, there's been some positive effects. So we're not going to trash it, but we're also going to say these kind of policies have to be done very carefully. Finally, my final slides, couple slides here. The most recent trend is something called mandatory human rights and environment due diligence law. These are coming primarily from the EU so far. And it really broadens these approaches, and it focuses on the responsibility of the corporate sector. It defines human rights and environment very broadly. There's real concept, they become responsible for the entire supply chains. There's a lot of questions like how far down the supply chain, how are you really going to monitor it? But this is something to keep an eye on in the future. These laws are just being passed now. We don't know what their impact is going to be. Final slide here. We just did a report for Oceana, the NGO in Canada, that is focused, that is organized, which works on sustainability in fisheries, and it's about what they can do around these, what their policies could be. It's supposed to be a guide for their policies on bringing issues of labor into their campaigns. And what we see when we did the report, we did this with former DOF officials, is Canada currently has no policy at all with respect to traceability, with respect to seafood imports, and they haven't even ratified ILO 188, the Working Fishing Convention. So Canada is way behind on all of these kinds of things. But there is a lot of movement. For example, there's a consultancy now on traceability, seafood traceability, boat to plate traceability. And there's also some private members bill on forced labor or modern slavery, which we think is limited, but a coalition of NGOs, which includes one of Melissa's PhD students, is working on draft legislation, which would be also a kind of mandatory human rights and environment due diligence law, which will probably not be adopted into law here, but it could influence what happens here in the future. So that's on the Canadian side. So last slide. Yeah, so we just want to thank again all the members of our team. Much of what we say here is based on our own research, but much of it is also based on the research of our team, some faculty and some students. So that's it. Yeah.
So is that the end of your talk, Melissa? Okay. Thank you. Thanks very much. Very interesting and wide-ranging, issues in the fisheries sector. We will get to the questions now. So we have a few questions that have come in from the audience that is watching on the YouTube live stream. This is not actually a question, but Melissa, this is particularly aimed at you. And Natasha is asking, you mentioned a project in Ireland, and I think Peter talked a little bit about the Ireland project subsequently. But Natasha is interested in knowing a little bit more about that project in Ireland.
Sure. Ireland's been really interesting for us to spend time in. We were there in June, and we'll go again at the end of October. The challenges for migrant workers in Ireland's fisheries have been put out by the media for like 15 years already. And Ireland already had a policy change whereby they said all non-EU workers would have to be paid a minimum wage in the fishery. So it was this idea that you get sort of a minimum basic amount. Interestingly, that policy shift, which was in 2016 or 17, has actually had dire consequences for migrant workers, because most workers that are part of the EU still operate on a traditional catch share system. And so they're making something like 3 times the amount compared to non-EU workers. And so the difference in wages is huge in Ireland of an EU worker. So it could be someone that's Irish or Polish versus the non-EU worker. So that's been a big problem. The workers, we've been working closely with the International Transport Federation, which actually has a campaign specifically in Ireland. And the campaign is kind of targeting a number of lenses, from using their media connections to raise awareness, but also taking vessel owners to court in the case of back wages that haven't been paid for a particular worker, or actually changing policy. And so it's really interesting to see the campaign piece around what's happening in Ireland and sort of this real unjustness, especially for migrant workers, which are mostly, we talked to someone from the Philippines, from Ghana, mostly Southeast Asia and West Africa. Oh, and Ethiopia too, I believe.
Egypt,
sorry. Yeah.
Egypt, and one of the things, there's a lot of dimensions to this. And one of them is the way fishing companies will often hire people from different countries, and it produces a kind of a racial dynamic on vessels, which can also prevent workers from acting in solidarity against the captain, which happens a lot. So what this has done is it really, really made much worse this kind of racialized hierarchy, because you have workers from Eastern Europe doing the same work as somebody from Egypt or Ghana, but they're being paid 3 times as much, right? And also the workers from outside of Europe are apparently subject to a lot more racial abuse, and so on. The legal case is for unpaid overtime. So the fishing companies claim that the workers have only been working 8 hours a day, whereas in reality, they've been working 15, 18 hours a day and not being paid for all that extra work. And so they're mobilizing evidence around the number of hours workers actually use in order to try to recover overtime pay. But it's also to make a bigger point about the situation of fishing workers in Ireland in order to have broader policy reform. It's a really interesting case, and it shows when you've got somebody who is really politically astute, in this case the ITF person, some of the strategies they pursue to try to kind of push change. But it's also very positive, right? On one hand, it's been negative. There's been worsening conditions, but it's also very positive in that it shows you some of the ways in which work can be done to try to address these problems. So.
And it is also interesting to see, how it is kind of spread across several countries in the world, both north and south, and so the second question is from Ankur Sukla from India, and starts with a thank you, and it says, when it comes to labor, ILO has certain guidelines covering wages, working conditions, etc. And Ankur's question is about what is the mandate in terms of compliance, in reference to the ILO or international laws.
I think something Peter can get into more detail, but I think only 20 countries have currently ratified ILO. And so our big point is if we actually had wider ratification, and compliance, this would be a really positive thing. So there are tools out there that we can use to enhance fish workers' lives, and the bare minimum really does make a difference. Peter was comparing ILO, which is working at sea, with the Marine Labor Convention, which is for all other seafarers, so cargo or cruise or whatever. What we were saying there is that ILO is weak compared to the Marine Labor Convention, but even so, starting with the ILO would be huge. I don't know if you have anything to add, Peter.
That is the Working Fishing Convention, ILO C-188, that I mentioned. It's got these basic standards. India has not ratified. Thailand has, by the way. When a country ratifies, the ILO will work with that country to ensure that there is some level of compliance with it, that there's a process in place. So, for example, Thailand has port in and port out inspection stations in every significant fishing ports. And they check with workers at every one of those to make sure that they're okay, that, you know, and so on and so on. It's impossible to completely enforce. For example, working hours in Thailand are definitely more than 14 hours a day on average, despite the ILO convention, which says it should be a maximum of 14 hours, but it's definitely a big step forward. But it's not going to, once you ratify, there has to be some kind of administrative process in place to try to ensure that at least some of those standards are being enforced. So that's how it would happen. So India would have to ratify, and they would have to put in place, you know, whatever infrastructure is necessary. What's interesting is that the infrastructure necessary to ensure that there's no IUU fisheries is often the same infrastructure as that you can use for this. So there's a kind of a positive interaction. That's what happened in Thailand. So these port in, port out inspection stations, they're both checking for legal and illegal fishing, and they're checking with the workers.
Yeah. And the question of reporting also, you know, how much can be avoided through the reporting process, you know, so, and we see that across all international, you know, conventions. Another question from Derek Armitage here in Waterloo. A really interesting talk. Thank you to both Melissa and Peter. Can you elaborate more on the feasibility for a safe labor certification scheme as a market-based approach to address this issue? In particular, I am wondering if there is also an ecological difference, maybe that makes this more challenging, because forests, aquaculture, etc. are stationary, while fisheries are transboundary and dynamic and mobile.
I think you just said it. I mean, there's not much to add. It's just much harder to monitor and to know what's going on. But this is where some of the current developments are happening. For example, this is why, for example, my view is another thing that some NGOs are pushing for is that every vessel should come into port at least once every 3 months, right? So that way you can, and then you have to be able to talk to the workers. You can't do this just by observing where vessels move and so on, the way Global Fishing Watch, some people would like to do. You have to be able to talk to workers in situations where they don't feel vulnerable to captains. I mean, it is just much more difficult than for aquaculture, absolutely. That doesn't mean there aren't ways forward. Other interesting developments, putting cameras on vessels. I think there's a limit on what that can do, but there's also possibilities. And the other thing is, in the future, what happens if, you know, through Elon Musk and other companies, when they put satellites up and fishing vessels are able to put Wi-Fi on their vessels, requiring Wi-Fi on vessels. So a worker can pick up a phone and just talk to somebody somewhere else. That could make it could be a game changer, right? So I do think changing technologies is going to make monitoring and communication more easily as things move forward, and it will help overcome some of these barriers. That's not to underestimate those barriers, though, it'll always be more difficult, I think, in fishing than it is in aquaculture.
Melissa,
yeah, I mean, you just think about even at port inspections, if people ratified 188, which would help eventually with certification, right? So if something was just going on at port, if you're actually going to talk with workers, you need, you know, people that speak multiple languages to do that properly. So you have to really invest in this to make a difference for workers. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so far certification has been really poor on labor.
I have a question that I would like to ask here, you know, is how much of this you know, conditions that you have talked of, you know, how does it compare to small scale fisheries and artisanal fisheries? You know, we see, you know, we talk about the same issues in really small scale fisheries, you know, unacceptable working conditions, lawlessness, criminality, and all of those are present in small scale fisheries as well. So from your research, you know, how do you compare those two? And the approach of response that you have talked about, do we need new approaches to deal with these same issues in small-scale fisheries, or there is a different way to deal with it?
I think the piece that is, at least in the past, and I'm not sure if that's true today, but when I was focusing on small-scale fishers anyways, the piece that got ignored was that often workers were also being hired on boats, right? Especially once a family had enough capital, then they wouldn't go fish, they would hire a worker. And that's sort of when those labor relations really start to unfold and can deteriorate. And yeah, so thinking about the worker and the dynamic between the worker, and of course it's a closer relationship because it's one or two workers. And so perhaps that relationship, it's a bit easier to mitigate, but there's still a relationship, an employee relationship going on. So there's that, but we've also seen, we did research in Myanmar where we also found not across all fisheries, but particular fisheries can be more rife for labor abuse. And so in this case, it was a raft fishery where men were kind of on these rafts without any radio or motorboat in the Gulf of Montana, about 80 kilometers offshore for months at a time, and quite vulnerable if a typhoon came in, but also, three men to a raft over 8 months at sea is quite precarious for quite minimal pay. And so that was also an example where there was a lot of abuse going on of the worker, including around payment. So I think there's insights from the distance water fishery for sure that can apply to small scale fisheries. The long hours in particular and the danger, violence, maybe it's not as pervasive across all small scale fisheries in the same way, but it's not to say it doesn't happen. There's certainly, at least in Cambodia, I've heard of gunfights at sea and tensions between fish farmers and fishers and fights that would break out to get broodstock or whatever. So I don't think it's something we can avoid thinking about, but in some ways it's hard to research because if you're in a community and who's going to tell on who, right? It's in some ways it's easier for workers. It's hard for workers to talk on the boat unless you're in Urbina and you can get their trust for 3 months. But at port, when there's a moment that the captain's away, you can suddenly talk and be like, compare written contracts. And so, yeah.
I think you guys all know about this better than we. Small-scale fisheries are usually diverse, right? And it's very hard to kind of generalize about them, I would suspect. But again, this is your area. But in terms of my experience in Southern Town, where I used to hang out with some small-scale fishers, I would not consider it to be major issues with workers, but they're all just hiring their own family members. Whereas when we did that research in Mon State in Myanmar with Ben Belton, and tried to take an agrarian studies approach, I think if there's a rule of thumb is when they started hiring migrant workers, in this case from other parts of the country. And I think anytime you bring migrant workers into the situation, the relationships change and there's much more potential for serious abuse. And one of the things to keep in mind, again, you guys are the experts, but as with farming all around, in many places around the world, people are having difficulty finding workers for their fishing boats, and they are turning to migrant workers. I've heard this the case about Eastern Asia, for example, in places like Korea and Japan, where they're hiring migrant workers from Southeast Asia into small-scale fisheries because they can no longer find enough labor for their own. And so I think once that happens, then there's much greater potential for problems to start emerging. That would be my main comment on that. But again, it's diverse. It's hard to kind of generalize.
Okay, I know we are almost at time, but I will take a last question from Idrisu Amadou from Ghana. And Idrisu is asking, how do we deal with the data challenges on exploitative labor in the sea? The WAC-free provides some data, but not sector disaggregated. Are there efforts to get such data?
You're letting me go first, Peter.
I don't know how to answer that.
This data question, this is real, right? Because getting numbers on any industry that's rife with exploitation and has this element of, you can call it informality or criminality. There's many different ways to kind of explain how one gets a job in fisheries. it's really difficult. So, there's good data in the Philippines, for example, for the number of workers that end up on fishing vessels. That's a country that keeps really good data on that type of overseas employment, but that's not the same for other countries, let alone if there's been a problem on the boat. That's certainly not collected nor necessarily reported back to the employment agency. And then in other fisheries, you have people coming by land, lots of informal agreements and not through a labor broker. And so, or if it is a labor and broker, it's an informal labor broker. So no, we don't have good stats. The Walk Free Foundation, as you say, they give a broad overview. And so maybe the bigger point right now is we know that forced labor is a challenge in fisheries, and that there are some horrendous cases, but also that things are often improving in many fisheries. We didn't get into all of that, but there's a serious effort. Peter was kind of hinting at these different efforts. And so maybe it's continually doing deep work in particular cases to see how change is happening might be the way to do it, given how hard it is to get the stats.
Yeah, I'm going to be very blunt. I think the Walk Free Foundation data is really problematic. To say there's 40,000 modern slaves in the world, and to sort of say as if somehow other people are not under conditions of labor abuse. For one thing, it really reduces what the labor problems that do happen in fisheries and many other sectors, and it kind of divides between those who are supposedly slaves and those who are not. And the other thing is, the bottom line is, how do you collect that kind of data? Because when you talk to a worker on a fishing boat out of Taiwan or China, they're not going to tell you anything. They're going to be really careful about what they tell you because they're so vulnerable to their captains, right? Once they're out on the vessel for 3 months or more, that captain can almost do anything they want in some ways. And so all that kind of data to me is just really problematic. I would take it with a huge grain of salt. It would not be my starting point for any of this kind of work. I would start by looking at issues sectorally, by saying what's happening in the Thai fisheries, what's happening in the Taiwanese fisheries, and so on and so on. And to recognize even within those fisheries, there's diversities. There's some captains and companies that might be worse than others and so on, but I wouldn't divide the world into 40,000 slaves and the rest. That's real. I'm being very blunt. I find that kind of approach to be really problematic. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, both Peter and Melissa. And the audience for asking those questions. You always wonder how many interesting questions can emerge when you lay out the topic and the issues. And thank you very much. And this is going to be available on YouTube, and then we continue to see that people engage with these issues and by watching the videos, and sometimes they write back, and if we do hear from some of the people that watch later on, and then we'll pass it on to you. Thank you very much once more. Again. So before we go, I'll request Seville to bring up the poster for next month. Seville, if you can do that, please, we'll announce it, and then we would say goodbye to everyone. So next month in October, we have Dr. Michaela Trimble, who is going to talk about transformative participatory processes and governance transitions towards small-scale fisheries co-management, I think especially based on our work in Uruguay and in the Latin Americas. So we all invite you on the 28th of October, same time, 8 a.m. Eastern Canada time. And this is going to be available again on the YouTube. Thank you very much once again to our speakers today and the audience and everyone. Thank you. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.